The state of Mississippi consistently ranks last, or second to last, in terms of per capita GDP. Its economic growth lags significantly behind the national average. The state of North Carolina, in contrast, scores in the top 10 states for economic output, with per capita GDP increasing year after year. In 2025, it ranked as the top state for business. What's curious about this is that before the Civil War, the situation was largely reversed. Mississippi was one of the wealthiest states in the nation, with the largest concentration of millionaires in the city of Natchez. Antebellum North Carolina, on the other hand, tended to be one of the poorer states in the American South. Clearly, the war had a drastic impact on both of them. I'm Anne Grace Evans, and this is a practical guide to American history. On the eve of the Civil War, John C. Calhoun had exclaimed, the South, what will become of her?" Turns out he was right to worry. Since the days of Jamestown, the South had been greedy, and now it would face the consequences. Going back to our earlier example, let's examine how things came to be the way they did. Before the war, North Carolina was struggling. Its lack of a major deep-water port meant that it never developed as strong of a plantation economy as the other states around it. What was the point of producing large quantities of product for export if there was no convenient way to export it? North Carolina was derisively known as the Rip Van Winkle state because it slept while the modern world passed it by. The legislature worried that if the state didn't figure something out quickly, people would leave. So the state had established the Board for Internal Improvements, a committee that would decide the direction for state projects and manage the fund for this purpose. The board and General Assembly threw themselves into railroad projects and roads, and by 1860, hundreds of miles of track had been built. After the war, because of all these newly created means of transportation, the Piedmont region of North Carolina became a hub for the tobacco, textile, and furniture industries. These factory and mill operations could also benefit from pre-war investments in infrastructure, the many water-powered facilities whose creation the legislature had promoted. Mississippi didn't do this. The government of Mississippi didn't plan to create an environment that would foster universities and budding industries because it didn't think it needed to. The business of cotton in antebellum Mississippi was thriving due to the low country soil and its proximity to major ports that opened into the Gulf of Mexico, like New Orleans. Like Alabama, if there was already plenty of money to be made through cotton, why change things? Of course, this was before the war. A war that Mississippi was completely invested in, even electing one of its senators, Jefferson Davis, as president of the rebellion. They were well aware that their entire economy was dependent upon enslaved labor, and that any threat from the federal government to take that resource away would be devastating for them, as indeed it ended up being. Not necessarily for the plantation owners themselves. They could sell off land or participate in a system known as sharecropping, renting out parcels of land to be worked by others. In these ways, those who had been wealthy before the war could at least get by. But for the less well-to-do, whose existence had basically revolved around the success of the cotton plantations, what was there to do when there's no other industry in town? This result was not inevitable. Adam Smith warned about it, and the Panic of 1837 foreshadowed it. An economy reliant on only one source of income will fail. The Mississippians who had made a living by selling goods or services in a thriving cotton economy would have found themselves unable to do so, now that the major players had gone bust. For those who were still planning to stick around instead of trying their luck up north, there was still the cotton. The desire for it as a fabric wasn't something that had changed. What was new was that now cotton producers couldn't just delegate the work to a large and unpaid workforce. They had to either harvest and process it themselves or else hire someone else to do it. So for the majority of people in the South who hadn't been large plantation owners before the war, they could become far more personally integrated into the cotton economy by picking the cotton themselves as tenant farmers. This was a far from ideal way of life. For one, people got to learn firsthand just how grueling the process of cotton picking was. But on top of this, these people weren't actually in business for themselves. They had to pay whatever rent they owed with the proceeds from whatever cotton they could sell. That is, assuming that the crop didn't fail in the first place. Sharecroppers were very much at the mercy of their landlords, who could call in their debt whenever they wanted, and keep them scraping from year to year, unable to get out from under what they owed, let alone be able to save to afford land of their own to create future generational wealth. Roughly 2/3 of sharecroppers were white, with the other third comprised of formerly enslaved black laborers. While newly free black families faced the same hardships as white sharecroppers, they also found other difficulties. Right before the war had ended, Congress passed the 13th Amendment. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. Notice the except there. For the unscrupulous, unwilling to break old habits of exploiting free labor, there was a loophole. As far as we have come as a society and as a country from the 19th century to now, there still remain unshakable legacies of our failure to heal the damage that was caused by slavery, and by the attitudes that were a product of slavery. The except as punishment clause may be one of the worst. If a person serving a prison sentence could effectively be enslaved, then that creates serious motivation to send black people to prison. Those people who just couldn't let go of the way things used to be before the war figured that keeping formerly enslaved people down would be essential if they were going to regain the old status quo. And if you think that's reading too much into this history, take it from Ashley Wilkes in Gone with the Wind, a not at all unbiased or historically accurate account, who says that that's exactly what they were doing. There was lots of debate about how to move forward after freedom. Disingenuous skeptics said emancipation ought not even to be attempted, out of consideration for the enslaved, of course, because what would become of them without any income or property? No problem, said some of the more radical Republicans. Remember Field Order Number 15? So just that, on a mass scale. Land redistribution, transitioning formerly enslaved people into self-sufficiency. Congressman Thaddeus Stevens said of the situation, "The whole fabric of Southern society must be changed, and never can it be done if this opportunity is lost. Without this government can never be, as it never has been, a true republic." To this end, Congress established the Bureau for the Relief of Freedmen and Refugees. It provided food, shelter, clothing, and schooling to people from the war-torn South, including formerly enslaved people. This was the government bureau that controlled confiscated Southern lands while Congress decided how to redistribute them. For some members of Congress, this was too extreme. They were more interested in restoring the Union and not angering Southerners than they were in the rights of the newly emancipated black population. Lincoln wanted to manage Reconstruction. One cabinet member discusses in his diary on April 14th the plans the cabinet was making for the governance of Southern states in anticipation of General Johnston's surrender of Confederate troops in North Carolina. The president remarked it would, he had no doubt, come soon and come favorable, for he had last night the usual dream which he had preceding nearly every great and important event of the war. He said it related to the water, that he seemed to be in some singular, indescribable vessel, and that he was moving with great rapidity towards an indefinite shore. But they would have to resume their conversation later, since Lincoln had to accompany his wife to the theater. There isn't much point in asking what if when it comes to history. What might have been had Lincoln lived. Tragically, he didn't, and his vice president, a Southerner, had very different views on how the country should emerge from the Civil War. To Andrew Johnson, nothing more was required for states and lawmakers to rejoin the Union than an oath of allegiance. Beyond that, he was willing to appease Southerners by returning their confiscated land and generally trying to smooth the re-entry as much as possible. But with the loss of what they had been promised, newly free Black families saw their chance at a new life effectively disappear. Maybe they could try to go someplace where they needed factory workers, but there they would be starting with nothing, as well as competing for employment with white workers coming back from the war. Returning to the places where they had been enslaved, even with all the trauma that would have held for them, at least offered them access to their roots and other connections in their past. It might have been the only guarantee, when all others had been snatched away by the federal government. The 13th Amendment might have legally granted freedom, but there's more to being free than legal status. The truth was that true liberty existed, as it always had, in the ownership of land and property, and white Southerners very well knew what it meant to take the chance of that away from the newly emancipated. It would mean that they would be forced to work the land, or possibly even serve the same people to whom they had been enslaved. They were no longer legally bound, but in effect they were still very much trapped, both by the financial realities of being tenant farmers, and psychologically by seeing the opportunity for a different life slip away. An entire civil war fought, and a constitutional amendment passed, and still many Black Americans may not have seen their lives improve in all the ways they would have hoped. Hope unrealized is crushing, and there were those who were determined that Black families should never escape from under that weight. The Ku Klux Klan was organized in 1865 in Pulaski, Tennessee, by Confederate veterans as a social club. But their continued anger at the loss of the war is really what swayed their group's motivations. They blamed the North for their misfortune, but mostly, they blamed Black Americans and resented any improvement to their lives as an affront to white Southerners. What this meant in practice was terrorizing Black people, punishing them for plantation owners' loss of wealth, and never allowing them to forget the way that things used to be. The Klan appealed to poor white tenant farmers who felt that they would never be able to get ahead. Even though these patrician former lords of the manor were definitely not their friends, might have even been the ones keeping their rents high, it could be argued were really the ones who got them all into this mess to begin with. It always seems to be the case that it only occurs to angry people to punch down instead of up. When Black people had been enslaved, at least then there was a class of people that poor whites could feel superior to. Now as tenant farmers, they all inhabited the bottom rung of Southern society together. They could have taken this opportunity to band together, to improve their collective conditions, and on occasion they did. But if someone else's life gets worse relative to mine, won't that make me feel like mine has gotten better? At any rate, this is the bargain that the white working classes, in the South and beyond, decided to make. It is the same bargain that settlers at Jamestown made, that as long as society was divided along the lines of race, rather than of class, all white men could find themselves in the upper echelon. And that was appealing. But to maintain that illusion of superiority, those who they deemed beneath them on the social hierarchy needed to feel that materially. What little the newly free had, they still thought it was too much. And they would see to it, by whatever means necessary, that Black people would never be in a position to get any more. So Republicans in the federal government sought to put legislation in place that would protect Black Americans living in states where their rights were threatened. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 stated that everyone born in America is entitled to U.S. citizenship, and that all U.S. citizens, regardless of race, are equally protected under the law. But to get the bill through Congress, Republicans had to hollow it out with concessions. Even James Wilson, who drafted the legislation, thought the final result was toothless. The president proved yet another obstacle. When the bill came to him, he vetoed it. Republicans had the votes to override this veto, but without federal support, there was really no way the legislation could be enacted. With the realization that this wouldn't be enough to protect Black citizens, Republicans in Congress drafted the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. It had the same definition of citizenship as the Civil Rights Act, and reaffirmed that all citizens should receive equal protection under the law on pain of losing federal funding, among other enforcement mechanisms. It also stated that you cannot hold office if you were in open rebellion against the United States. What happened next provided an opening for the pro-amendment faction. In southern states like Mississippi and South Carolina, Black codes were adopted. Extra restrictions and requirements placed only on Black people that kept them from fully being able to exercise their rights. And since the civil rights legislation that Congress had managed to pass lacked any real enforcement mechanism, white legislators and their enforcers in the Klan were able to block any actual change. The result, unsurprisingly, was largely a return to the old status quo. When the formerly Confederate states met President Johnson's low bar for readmittance, the elected officials they sent to Washington reflected just how little had really changed. Alexander H. Stephens was elected to the Senate out of Georgia. Remember that guy? The guy who gave a speech that stated that oppressing human beings was the only moral framework for a government to have. The guy who proudly served as the vice president of an armed insurrection of the very government he planned to join now. That guy. Even moderates who were eager to heal rifts were horrified that the same people responsible for tearing the country apart were now going to legislate for it, like nothing had happened. Even though Stephens was never seated, it had still become clear that for things to actually change, for all the sacrifice to have been worth it, more radical measures were needed. Not only were Republicans able to pass the 14th Amendment, they were able to get a whole raft of civil rights and Reconstruction legislation through Congress. The Reconstruction Act of 1867 created 5 military districts under the U.S. Army. These would uphold the law when Southerners were not inclined to do so. Returning states also had to draft new constitutions. They also had to ratify the 14th Amendment. The Reconstruction Act was passed over Johnson's veto, and Republicans responded to this by also introducing the Tenure of Office Act, which limited the president's power to remove civil officers without Senate approval. They followed this with the 15th Amendment, which states that the right of citizens to vote shall not be abridged or denied by the United States or by any state. They wanted to ensure that Reconstruction would not be undermined, not by a state or by a president. With federal troops ensuring that Black men were able to vote, Black legislators were elected to state and local offices throughout the South. Areas that elected Black legislators saw a rise in public education and literacy. In the period immediately after the Civil War, the Freedmen's Bureau helped provide funding and materials for teachers looking to set up schools for formerly enslaved people. Literacy for Black Americans had been forbidden in the South, and now a whole new world of opportunity was being opened. The first historically Black colleges and universities, such as Howard in D.C., started to be built during this period, ready to get to work training a new generation of Black leaders who would go on to serve their communities by building more schools and promoting civil rights. W.E.B. Du Bois, looking back decades later, reflected on this time. It is fair to say that the Negro carpetbag governments established the public schools of the South. Although recent researches have shown many germs of a public school system in the South before the war, there can be no reasonable doubt that common school instruction in the South, in the modern sense of the term, was founded by the Freedmen's Bureau and missionary societies, and that the state public school system was formed mainly by Negro Reconstruction governments. Black intellectual life flourished during Reconstruction. Newspapers like the New Orleans Tribune advocated for greater reforms as Black Americans attempted to close the socioeconomic gap with whites. Successful Black families such as the Delaney's of Raleigh, North Carolina, created their own dynasties. Successive generations went on to be educators, doctors, authors, and intellectuals who helped create vibrant Black communities. As you can imagine, there were many people in the post-war South who viewed Black success with anger and jealousy. The powers that be in Southern society had always told poorer whites that no matter how tough life got for them, they could always take comfort in the fact that there was a group of people lower on the totem pole. And now here was that group finally getting the chance to rise, while the white working class found itself in much the same position it was in before the war. Worse, actually, since so much industry had been destroyed. For a class of people who felt entitled to what they were told was a superior place in society, justification both for exploitation of Black people as well as targeting white laborers angered downwards, rather than at the planter class. Extreme action seemed acceptable. Even with federal troops there to monitor and protect the rights of the Black population, the KKK was still able to perpetrate acts of intimidation and violence against Black citizens. As supporters of the abolitionist cause had predicted, moving forward meaningfully was difficult without land redistribution. Tsar Alexander II of Russia said of his efforts to free Russian serfs, "I did more in giving land, as well as personal liberty, than America did for the Negro slave, set free by the proclamation of President Lincoln." He was right. Andrew Johnson was never committed to Reconstruction. But when he fired Edwin Stanton, Secretary of War under Lincoln and champion of his vision of remaking the South, it was the last straw. Republicans had passed the Tenure of Office Act for this very reason, because they feared that Johnson would attempt to sabotage their agenda. Given his open defiance of the law, Congress felt that it was their constitutional duty to draw up articles of impeachment, the first impeachment of a president in U.S. history. Though he was eventually acquitted in the Senate, the relationship with his own party had fractured beyond repair. It paved the way for a new political hopeful in 1868, former Union Army General Ulysses S. Grant. Americans do love a war hero, and so relative political novice Grant became the 18th President of the United States. Grant was actually invested in the idea of making Reconstruction work. During his time as a general in the war and then fighting the Klan, he had increasingly grown into a champion of civil rights. As president, he supported legislation that would further protect the rights of Black Americans and empower them to better advocate for themselves. In 1870 and 1871, he signed the Force Acts. Now there would be actual boots on the ground to make sure that there were no terrorists at polling places, stopping people from exercising their basic rights. The South was undergoing major upheavals. But if you lived in the North, your experience of a country at war with itself would have been a very different one. Of course, there was still the pain and the loss of wartime, but in many ways, the North was thriving. Congress was able to be far more productive than it had ever been, establishing the National Academy of Sciences to advise the government on scientific and technical advances, creating a system of national taxation, and introducing the first major national currency, precursor of the dollar we still use today. Even though the federal government was fighting a civil war, they were still looking beyond, to a post-war future when the United States would not only rebuild, but start positioning itself as a force to be reckoned with on the world stage. Congress even used the war years to begin construction on the current Capitol building dome. So confident were they in their vision of a victorious and forward-looking nation. Congress's determination to leave the bloody and traumatic years of the Civil War behind matched the enthusiasm of industrialists and entrepreneurs to seize this moment of upheaval and change to transform the country. People had been going west for decades, but the paths there were slow-going and sometimes treacherous. Technology had improved trains to the point where they were achieving up to 60 miles per hour and were becoming the most efficient means of long-haul travel. That is, if there was track already laid. For a lot of the country, this still wasn't a reality yet. A transcontinental railroad that would expand from coast to coast and connect every city and every outpost was the next logical step. The dream to be realized for solidifying American control over the continent, gaining quicker access to raw goods and manufactured products, and ultimately establishing dominance on the global economic stage. The first transcontinental railroad connecting Council Bluffs, Iowa to San Francisco Bay was completed in 1869. This finally linked the eastern lines to the western lines, reducing the time and the cost of travel. It had taken 6 grueling years to build using predominantly Chinese and Irish immigrant labor. By the time it was completed, the country had succumbed to railroad fever. Like canals in the 1820s and 1830s, like the AI craze today, people believed they saw the future, and they wanted a piece. There is a historical precedent for this. The saying, "all roads lead to Rome," isn't just an expression, it was a fact. The Roman Empire was able to exercise control over such vast amounts of territory because it had an extensive road system. A more connected landmass could support much more in-depth local administration. The federal government could provide services much quicker to different regions of the country, meaning that these would be more integrated in and dependent on the country as a whole. But this more tight-knit organization also marked a sea change. The United States of America now had the capacity to expand wherever railroad track could be laid, and maybe even beyond. Plus, now the federal government could reap the benefits of national prosperity through a program of direct taxation, while dictating the pace and structure of daily aspects of people's lives. The railroad, like Rome's roads, allowed the government to have a firm grasp over what was happening throughout the country in a new, even imperious way. America was becoming its own self-contained empire. But are we even supposed to be an empire? Is that something that's consistent with our Republican ideals? Initially, this had been Thomas Jefferson's worry with the federal government, that the money men in the cities would extract the goods from the working man, spinning their straw into gold. It's certainly a more modern preoccupation. What do we lose in pursuit of more? More wealth, more glory, and who specifically loses out? But at least for a time, there didn't seem to be too much hand-wringing. Everyone was eager to expand the transcontinental railroad right away. The small towns that might grow and reap the benefits of extra visitors, the industries whose product could now move even faster, and all the people who could invest in the railroads and own a piece of the future. New York City, naturally, was the hub for all that investment. As residences moved farther uptown, downtown became a commercial district. Buildings grew taller, like the Western Union Building on Broadway, and the first elevated trains began to run. The financial district was a hive of activity, aided by a dominant Republican Party that was always willing to create opportunity for business and investment. In the productive congressional sessions of the war years, Congress had passed the Homestead Act, which would attempt to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. By granting 160 acres of surveyed public land in the West to citizens, or future citizens, who had never fought against the United States, they wanted to promote the growth and expansion of the United States, and reward Americans who had remained loyal. Settlers would be granted this land to, quote, improve, and they were encouraged to pack up their eastern lives for the promise of a homestead. The mass migration of people that Congress hoped would move west at the end of the war coincided with the investments they were making in the transcontinental railroad. With the linking of settlers in the west to markets in the east, Congress was cultivating a nation of amber waves of grain that could feed a growing nation as it set its sights on the future. New cities were springing up around railroad hubs like Chicago and St. Louis. The amount of U.S. territory was growing with the purchase of Alaska from Russia in 1867. What Congress had considered to be essentially empty land started to be populated by settlers from the east, moving in with barbed wire fencing. Barbed wire fencing turned out to be one of the most consequential inventions for westward expansion because it was cheap and lightweight, yet it was extremely effective in enclosing land for farmers and ranchers. Homesteaders carved up large parcels and plowed the Great Plains, dramatically changing the landscape of the western United States. Of course, this vast, wide-open space that Congress was selling as a new frontier wasn't actually empty. People had inhabited it for thousands of years, and the government didn't believe they would act favorably towards being pushed off their land. Which is why a military presence of forts and installations began to creep westward. The nations of the American West, the Comanche, the Apache, the Lakota, and the Arapaho, among others, indeed, did not look on this favorably. During the Civil War, they had been able to push back settlers encroaching on their land, showing masterful tactical skill, attacking trade routes, and terrorizing settlers. But now the U.S. Army was able to concentrate its full military might on aiding settler expansion. In 1868, many of these nations signed the Treaty of Fort Laramie, creating the Great Sioux Reservation, the designated area in the Black Hills of South Dakota that was exclusively deemed Indian territory. No white settlers could move there, and the U.S. military had to abandon all its posts in the area. It didn't take long for the United States to go back on its word. The Black Hills was a site sacred to the Lakota Sioux and other nations in the region, and that is ultimately why the U.S. government had agreed to cede that territory. But they didn't know there was gold there at the time. When the military confirmed the presence of gold in 1874, the government tried to buy the Black Hills from the Sioux, but they had no interest in selling. Instead of accepting this, the U.S. decided it would take the territory by force. The Battle of the Little Bighorn took place in 1876. In most American history classes, we learn it as Custer's Last Stand, and it was a great victory for the Sioux Lakota over the U.S. Army. But this only caused the military to redouble its efforts to subdue any resistance to its takeover of the Black Hills and the rest of the western United States. Some nations continued to mount armed campaigns, but Little Bighorn had really been their last big victory. By 1890, the western frontier was considered closed and settled. American ambitions were to become masters of the whole continent. Growth was booming. Railroads made things cheaper to transport, meaning greater capital to invest in expanding businesses and factories. Between 1870 and 1910, America's share of global manufacturing increased 12%, while Britain's decreased by 14%. Congress had passed an act to encourage immigration in 1864 to attract more people to work in factories and to populate the western frontier. America certainly looked like an empire, conquering and settling new places and sending people to inhabit and reap the benefit of those new territories. Whatever the qualms of a Jeffersonian or more conservative thinker about the hubris of constantly expanding and striving for more, Republicans in Congress felt that progress could not be halted. The West must be won. It was the only way to fulfill America's destiny. Epilogue. If there is a lesson to be taken from the Reconstruction period, it is that only taking half measures out of a fear of rocking the boat is basically like taking no measures at all. From the beginning, the Founding Fathers were guilty of this, kicking the can down the road on the slavery question. It took ripping the country apart to undo the effects of that poor decision. The general policy of amnesty that the federal government adopted towards the South after the war, while designed to heal wounds, just left them open by not creating closure. In one case in particular, failure to enforce any punishment at all led to a deepening of the rift. Nathan Forrest, the man responsible for the massacre of black soldiers at Fort Pillow, was allowed to resume his life without having to answer for his crimes. And it turned out that, although the Confederacy may have surrendered, he wasn't done with the fight to subjugate black Americans. He was an early member of the Ku Klux Klan and played a big part in its spread. What if there had been consequences in the days after the Civil War? What if the Union had really drawn a line in the sand when it came to the central issue? Slavery was done, once and for all, and no efforts, past, present, or future, to undermine that fact would be tolerated. The fear was that continuing to litigate this, even after the Confederacy's surrender, would prolong the pain of the conflict, and Andrew Johnson really had no interest beyond just putting things back the way they were before. No one really seems to think about, if you don't do the painful thing now, go in and cause the disruption to fix the problem, it will only continue to fester, and the resentment will continue to build until you arrive at the exact same collision course that you were trying to get away from. While there are many examples of issues that have played out like this in American history, race is the one that continues to have the greatest impact on our daily lives. I've written an entire other episode on Black history because I don't feel that I can do it justice in the span of a simple chronology. But I really wanted to underscore something about this time period. Restoration is a massive missed opportunity. Would everything be perfect today if we had honored the original land grants we made to newly emancipated families? Of course not. But so many failures and continued prejudices that divide our society to this day probably wouldn't be there. This is ground that I covered in the introduction. But history isn't just a random sequence of events. One thing happens, and then another thing happens after it. It's a layer cake, and one generation builds on another. One generation arrives in the world with certain advantages because the people who came before them gifted them with those advantages. So if your predecessors have no advantages to give, you're going to start the race behind everyone else, which means the people who follow you will start at an even greater deficit, and so on and so forth. Add to this the fact that Black Americans very quickly went on to lose what little power they did have, and that is a hole that becomes very difficult to climb out of. Unfortunately, that's where we're headed next.